A man walked into one of the toughest prisons in America, and from day one, he never spoke a word. Not to the guards, not to the inmates, not even when the most feared bully in the yard mocked him, threatened him, and tried every way to break him. Everyone thought he was weak. Everyone thought he was afraid. But when the truth finally came out about why he stayed silent, it shattered everything they believed. Get ready for a story about strength, sacrifice, and the power of silence that will change the way you see courage forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The Silent Arrival. The heavy steel doors of Redstone Correctional Facility slammed shut behind Marcus Webb with a finality that echoed through the concrete corridors. He stood motionless in the processing area, his dark eyes fixed somewhere beyond the cinderblock walls, somewhere the guards couldn't see. Officer Henderson barked questions at him. Name, ID number, next of kin. But Marcus simply stared ahead, his lips pressed together in a thin line. "You deaf or something?" Henderson snapped, his patience already wearing thin. Marcus didn't flinch. He reached for the clipboard and wrote his responses in neat, deliberate handwriting, sliding the paper back across the scarred metal desk. Henderson glanced at the answers, then at Marcus, his expression shifting from annoyance to suspicion. "So you can write, but you won't talk?" he muttered. "This is going to be a long stretch for you, buddy." Marcus was assigned to Cell Block D, a place where weakness was currency and silence was interpreted as fear. As he walked down the corridor with his bedding tucked under one arm, dozens of eyes tracked his movement. Catcalls and whistles bounced off the walls. Someone threw a wadded piece of paper that hit him in the shoulder. Marcus didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge any of it. His cellmate was a wiry man named Jimmy Ortiz, serving 5 years for armed robbery. Jimmy sat on the lower bunk, sizing up the new arrival with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read people quickly in this place. "Name's Jimmy," he said, extending a hand. Marcus shook it firmly but said nothing. Jimmy's eyebrows rose. "Strong silent type, huh? That's cool. Just so you know, this block ain't easy. You got guys in here who'll test you just for breathing their air." Marcus nodded slightly and began making his bunk with military precision, each corner folded with exactness that suggested discipline from another life. Jimmy watched with growing curiosity. Most new inmates were jittery, talkative, trying to feel out their surroundings. This guy was different. He moved with purpose, but without aggression, silent but not submissive. That evening in the chow hall, Marcus learned what Jimmy meant about being tested. He was standing in line with his tray when a massive shoulder slammed into him from behind, sending his tray clattering to the floor. Laughter erupted around him. Marcus turned slowly to face his aggressor, a 6'4" mountain of muscle named Darius Reaper Johnson, the undisputed king of Cell Block D. "Oops," Reaper said with a grin that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Didn't see you there, new fish. You got something to say about it?" The cafeteria had gone quiet. Every inmate knew what this was, a dominance play, a test to establish the pecking order. Marcus looked at Reaper for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he bent down, picked up his tray, and walked back to get another meal without saying a word. The silence that followed was different from before. It was charged with confusion. Reaper's grin faltered. "You ignoring me?" he called out. Marcus didn't respond. He simply got his food and found a seat at an empty table, eating methodically as if nothing had happened. Jimmy slid into the seat across from him, his face a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Man, you got a death wish?" Jimmy whispered urgently. "That's Reaper. Nobody disrespects Reaper and walks away." Marcus met his eyes briefly, and Jimmy saw something there that stopped his words. Not fear, not defiance, but something deeper. Something that looked almost like grief. Marcus returned to his meal, and Jimmy decided that maybe this silent cellmate was more complicated than anyone realized. The escalation. The next morning during yard time, Marcus stood alone near the basketball court, watching the game without expression. The autumn sun beat down on the concrete yard, creating pockets of heat that shimmered above the asphalt. Most inmates had formed their groups, the Latinos near the weights, the whites by the phones, the blacks dominating the court. Marcus belonged to none of them, a solitary figure in prison blues that somehow stood out more for his stillness than any action. Reaper had noticed. From his position holding court near the weight benches, surrounded by his crew, he kept glancing at the silent new inmate. It bothered him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. In Reaper's world, respect was everything, and respect was earned through fear. This guy, this Marcus, wasn't showing fear. Worse, he wasn't showing anything at all. "Yo, Silent Bob!" Reaper called out, his voice carrying across the yard. Several inmates turned to watch. Marcus's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, but he didn't turn around. "I'm talking to you, Fish!" Reaper stood, his massive frame casting a long shadow as he approached. His crew followed, sensing entertainment. Reaper walked right up to Marcus, invading his space in a way that would make most men either back down or swing. Marcus turned slowly, his face still neutral, his hands remaining at his sides. "What's your problem, man?" Reaper demanded. "You think you're better than everybody? Too good to talk?" Marcus simply looked at him, and there was something in that gaze that gave even Reaper pause. Not challenge, not submission, but a depth of sadness that seemed completely out of place in this confrontation. "He don't talk," Jimmy called out from a safe distance. "Leave him alone, Reaper. He ain't bothering nobody." Reaper shot Jimmy a glare that made him take a step back. "Nobody asked you, Ortiz. I'm trying to welcome our new neighbor. Ain't that right, Silent Bob?" He shoved Marcus's shoulder, hard. Marcus absorbed the impact but didn't retaliate. He didn't speak. He just stood there, taking it. This went on for 3 days. Reaper would find Marcus somewhere, the library, the chow hall, the showers, and escalate his provocations. He'd knock books out of Marcus's hands. He'd spit in his food. He'd spread rumors that Marcus was a snitch, that he was a child molester, anything to turn the population against him. And through it all, Marcus never spoke, never fought back, never showed anger. The other inmates began to have divided opinions. Some thought Marcus was the biggest coward they'd ever seen. Others, particularly the older timers who'd done decades inside, watched with growing interest. There was something about the way Marcus carried himself, the straight back, the controlled movements, the absence of the fear response, that suggested this wasn't weakness. This was something else entirely. Officer Henderson noticed too. During a routine cell inspection, he paused at Marcus's bunk. The cell was immaculate, military style. On the small shelf were 3 items: a worn leather-bound journal, a photograph face down, and a medal, a Purple Heart. Henderson picked up the medal, examining it, then looked at Marcus with new eyes. "You served?" he asked. Marcus met his gaze and nodded once. "Iraq? Afghanistan?" Another nod. Henderson set the medal down carefully, with respect he didn't show most inmates. "That Reaper guy giving you trouble?" Marcus didn't respond, but his jaw tightened slightly. Henderson sighed. "Look, I can't protect you if you don't tell me what's happening. In here, silence gets you killed." Marcus picked up a small notepad from his bunk and wrote quickly, showing Henderson the message. "I can handle it." The officer read it, frowned, and shook his head. "I hope you know what you're doing." That night, Jimmy lay in his bunk, listening to the quiet sounds of Marcus writing in his journal in the bunk above. "Can I ask you something?" Jimmy said softly. The writing stopped. "You ain't gotta answer, but whatever reason you got for not talking, is it worth dying for? Because that's where this is heading, man. Reaper ain't gonna stop." The silence stretched between them. Then the writing resumed, and Jimmy heard something that sounded almost like a suppressed sob. He didn't ask again. The breaking point. 2 weeks into Marcus's sentence, Reaper's frustration had reached a boiling point. Every attempt to break the silent inmate had failed, and worse, some of the other prisoners were starting to look at Marcus with something approaching respect. In Reaper's hierarchy, this was unacceptable. He'd built his reputation on fear and dominance, and one quiet man was threatening to undermine years of carefully maintained control. The confrontation came during lunch on a Tuesday. The cafeteria was packed, the air thick with the smell of institutional food and body odor. Marcus was sitting at his usual table with Jimmy when Reaper and 4 of his crew surrounded them. "Last chance, Silent Bob," Reaper announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "You say something right now, Apologize for disrespecting me, or I'm gonna make you scream. Marcus looked up from his tray, his expression unchanged. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and returned his attention to his food. The disrespect was clear to everyone watching. Reaper's face flushed with rage. Wrong answer. He grabbed Marcus's tray and threw it across the room, then seized Marcus by the collar, hauling him to his feet. The cafeteria erupted in shouts, and the sound of benches scraping as inmates crowded around to watch. Reaper, don't! Jimmy pleaded, but one of Reaper's crew shoved him back. Reaper pulled back his fist, ready to deliver a devastating blow, and then something happened that no one expected. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't raise his hands to defend himself. Instead, he looked Reaper directly in the eyes and opened his mouth wide. Reaper froze. Everyone close enough to see fell silent. Where Marcus's tongue should have been, there was only a scarred stump. The revelation rippled through the crowd like an electric shock. Marcus couldn't speak because he literally couldn't. His tongue had been cut out. The silence was absolute. Reaper's fist dropped slowly to his side, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and something that might have been shame. Marcus closed his mouth, pulled himself free from Reaper's loosened grip, and walked calmly out of the cafeteria. The guards, who had been moving to intervene, stopped, uncertain of what they'd just witnessed. Jesus Christ, Jimmy whispered, his face pale. What the hell happened to him? The question hung in the air, but no one had an answer. Reaper stood motionless, his carefully constructed persona cracking. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. You couldn't intimidate a man who'd already suffered something worse than anything this place could throw at him. Word spread through Redstone like wildfire. By evening count, every inmate knew about Marcus's missing tongue. The speculation was rampant and wild. Some said he'd been tortured by enemy soldiers overseas. Others claimed it was cartel retribution. A few suggested he'd cut it out himself to keep from snitching. Each theory was darker than the last, and each made Marcus more of an enigma than before. Officer Henderson called Marcus to his office that evening. Sit, he said, gesturing to a chair. Marcus sat, his posture perfect, his hands folded in his lap. Henderson pulled out Marcus's file, thicker than most. Says here you did 3 tours. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and a bunch of commendations. Honorable discharge. Model soldier. He looked up. What happened to you, Webb? Marcus reached for the pen and paper Henderson pushed across the desk. His handwriting was steady, not relevant to my incarceration. Henderson leaned back in his chair, studying the man across from him. You're in for manslaughter. Says you walked into a bar and beat a man nearly to death with your bare hands. No witnesses willing to testify about what provoked it. You pled guilty, didn't offer any defense. Why? Marcus wrote again. He deserved it. Henderson waited for more, but nothing came. Look, what Reaper did today. Showing everyone your condition. That's going to change things in here. Some guys might leave you alone now. Others might see you as an easier target, thinking you can't call for help. You need to be careful. Marcus nodded and stood to leave. Webb, Henderson called out as Marcus reached the door. That photo in your cell, the one you keep face down. Whoever's in it, that's who you're protecting by staying silent, isn't it? Marcus's entire body went rigid. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, without turning around, he walked out of the office, leaving Henderson's question unanswered, but confirmed by his reaction. Back in his cell, Marcus lay in his bunk staring at the concrete ceiling. Jimmy climbed up and sat at the edge of Marcus's bunk, something he'd never done before. I ain't gonna ask what happened to you, Jimmy said quietly. But I want you to know something. Whatever you're carrying, whatever made you this way, you ain't gotta carry it alone in here. I got your back. Marcus turned his head to look at Jimmy, and for the first time since arriving at Redstone, the slightest hint of gratitude crossed his features. He held out his hand, and Jimmy shook it. They'd become more than cellmates. They'd become brothers, in the only way prison allowed. Respect in silence. The atmosphere in Cell Block D shifted dramatically after the cafeteria incident. Marcus walked through the corridors the next morning to find that the usual catcalls and harassment had vanished. Inmates who had previously mocked him now looked away or nodded with cautious respect. The revelation of his missing tongue had transformed him from a target into something else, a mystery that demanded acknowledgement. Reaper, however, was struggling with what had happened. His reputation was built on intimidation and dominance, but how do you intimidate a man who'd already endured unimaginable trauma? His crew watched him carefully, sensing his uncertainty. During breakfast, Reaper sat at his usual table, pushing food around his tray, uncharacteristically quiet. His lieutenant, a scarred veteran named Tyrell, leaned in close. "What you gonna do about the silent dude?" Tyrell asked. "People are talking, saying maybe you went too far." Reaper's jaw clenched. "I didn't know," he muttered. "How was I supposed to know?" Tyrell shrugged. "Don't matter what you knew. Matters what people think now. Some are saying he's tougher than you because nothing you did broke him." This observation lit a fire in Reaper's eyes, but it was different from his usual rage. This was more complicated. A mixture of anger, confusion, and something that might have been curiosity. He watched Marcus enter the cafeteria, collect his tray, and sit alone. The man's movements were economical, purposeful. There was no wasted energy, no nervous tics. Reaper had done 12 years inside and had never seen anyone carry themselves quite like this. Later that morning during yard time, something unexpected happened. Marcus was sitting on a bench reading a book, a thick paperback about military history, when a young inmate named Devin approached him hesitantly. Devin was 19, scrawny, and terrified of everyone. He'd been in Redstone for 3 weeks and had already been extorted by multiple inmates. "Excuse me," Devin said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked up from his book, his expression neutral. I heard what happened, that you can't talk. I just wanted to say, I think that's the bravest thing I've ever seen. The way you stood up to Reaper without saying a word." Devin's hands were shaking. Could you teach me how to be strong like that?" Marcus studied the young man for a long moment. Then he gestured to the bench beside him. Devin sat, nearly vibrating with nervous energy. Marcus pulled out the small notepad he now carried and wrote, "Strength isn't about fighting. It's about knowing what you're fighting for." Devin read the words, his eyes filling with tears. "I don't got nothing to fight for," he said. "My mom died while I was in here. I got nobody." Marcus wrote again, "Then fight for who you want to become." He tore off the page and handed it to Devin, who clutched it like it was made of gold. From across the yard, Reaper watched this interaction, his expression unreadable. Tyrell stood beside him. "You seeing this? Kids treating Silent Bob like some kind of guru." Reaper didn't respond, but something in his stance had changed. That afternoon, Marcus was in the prison library, one of the few places he found peace. The library was run by Mrs. Chen, a civilian volunteer in her 60s who'd been working at Redstone for 15 years. She'd heard about Marcus and had been watching him with interest. As he returned a book on PTSD treatment, she spoke softly. "I read your file," she said. "I shouldn't have, but I did. It doesn't say why you can't speak, but it says enough about where you've been." Marcus went still, his guard rising. Mrs. Chen continued. "I've worked with a lot of veterans in here. They carry things that words can't touch. If you ever want to write about it, not for anyone else, just for yourself, I can get you journals, as many as you need." Marcus considered this, then wrote on his notepad. "Why would you do that?" Mrs. Chen smiled sadly. "Because silence is a prison too, Mr. Webb, and you're already serving enough time." Something in her words penetrated the armor Marcus had built around himself. He nodded slowly, and Mrs. Chen pulled out a brand new leather-bound journal from beneath her desk. "Start whenever you're ready," she said. "No one will read it but you." That evening, the prison showed a movie in the common area, an old western. Most inmates attended, happy for any break from routine. Marcus sat in the back row, Jimmy beside him. Halfway through the film, Reaper stood from his seat several rows ahead and, to everyone's surprise, walked back and sat down next to Marcus. The air became electric with tension. "We need to talk," Reaper said, his voice low. Marcus turned to look at him, one eyebrow slightly raised. "I know you can't talk back, but you can listen." Reaper paused, clearly uncomfortable. "What I did in the cafeteria, forcing you to show everyone, that wasn't right. I didn't know about your situation, but that don't excuse it." Marcus's expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. Reaper continued. "I've been in here a long time. I became somebody people fear because I thought that was the only way to survive. But you got everybody's respect without throwing a single punch, without saying a single word. I need to understand how." The vulnerability in Reaper's voice was shocking. This wasn't the prison bully. This was a man confronting something about himself he'd been avoiding for years. Marcus pulled out his notepad and wrote for several minutes. When he finished, he showed it to Reaper. "You're respected because people fear what you'll do to them. That's not respect, it's compliance. Real respect comes from who you are when you have nothing to prove. I have nothing left to prove." Reaper read the words twice, his jaw working as he processed them. "Nothing left to prove," Reaper repeated quietly. "Man, I got everything to prove. Every single day." Marcus wrote again. "To who?" The question hung between them. Reaper had no answer. He stood slowly, looked at Marcus for a long moment, then nodded. Not a gesture of dominance or dismissal, but acknowledgement. As he walked back to his seat, the other inmates watched in amazement. Something fundamental had just shifted in the social structure of Cell Block D. The journal entries. Marcus began writing in the journal Mrs. Chen had given him. Every night after lights out, by the dim glow of the safety light outside his cell, he would sit on his bunk and pour out words he could never speak. Jimmy respected his privacy, never asking what he wrote, but he could hear the scratch of pen on paper for hours sometimes, and occasionally, the sound of Marcus's controlled breathing that suggested he was fighting back tears. The entries started simple, almost mechanical. Dates, descriptions of daily routines, observations about other inmates. But gradually, they deepened. Marcus wrote about Afghanistan, about the village his unit had been trying to protect, about the translator named Fahim who had become his friend. He wrote about the night the insurgents came, about the choices he'd made, and about what came after. The months in the military hospital, the medical discharge, the return to a country that didn't know what to do with broken soldiers. One entry, written 2 weeks after he started the journal, read, "They took my tongue because I spoke the truth. They thought removing it would erase what I'd said, what I'd testified to. They were wrong. Silence speaks louder than any words I could have used. Every day I don't speak is a day I remember why it matters. Every day I stay silent. I honor those who can't speak anymore." The journal became Marcus's therapy, his confession, his way of processing trauma that had no other outlet. He wrote about guilt, survivor's guilt that ate at him in the early morning hours. He wrote about anger, at the system that had failed his unit, at the politicians who sent them into impossible situations, at himself for coming home when others didn't. And he wrote about Emily, the name that explained everything. Meanwhile, Marcus's influence was spreading through Cell Block D in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. Devin, the young inmate he'd spoken with in the yard, began following him around like a shadow. Marcus didn't discourage it, and gradually, other younger inmates joined them. During yard time, a small group would gather around Marcus as he wrote responses to their questions about surviving inside, about staying strong, about maintaining dignity in a place designed to strip it away. Officer Henderson noticed the change in the block's dynamics. Violence was down. The usual tension that permeated the air had lessened. Inmates who had previously been at each other's throats were leaving each other alone. He mentioned it to the warden during a weekly briefing. "It's the strangest thing," Henderson said. "We've got a guy who can't talk becoming some kind of stabilizing influence. Even Reaper's been quieter." The warden, a pragmatic woman named Patricia Lawson, who'd been running prisons for 20 years, was skeptical. "People don't change in here, Henderson. They adapt to survive. but they don't fundamentally change. Watch this Marcus Webb carefully. Men who gather followers in prison are usually planning something. But Henderson wasn't convinced. There was something different about what was happening in Cell Block D. Reaper himself was undergoing an unexpected transformation. He started spending time in the library, something he'd never done in 12 years inside. Mrs. Chen noticed him browsing the self-help section, looking uncomfortable and out of place among the books. One afternoon, he approached her desk. "You got anything about, I don't know, changing your life?" he asked awkwardly. Mrs. Chen didn't show surprise, though she felt it. "What kind of change are you looking for, Darius?" She was one of the few people who used his real name instead of his nickname. Reaper shifted his weight, looking around to make sure no one was watching. "I don't want to be this person no more," he said quietly. "The person everyone's scared of. I'm tired of it. That Marcus guy, he made me realize I don't even know who I am without the fear." Mrs. Chen smiled gently and pulled several books from behind her desk, including one called The Road to Character. "Start with this," she said. "And Mr. Johnson? Real change starts when we're tired enough of who we are to risk becoming someone new. It takes more courage than maintaining the reputation you have." Reaper took the book, nodded, and left quickly, hiding it under his shirt. That evening, Marcus received an unexpected visitor during free time. Reaper approached his cell, where Marcus was sitting on his bunk reading. Jimmy tensed immediately, but Marcus remained calm. "Can I come in?" Reaper asked. Marcus gestured to the chair that served as their cell's only furniture. Reaper sat, dwarfing the small plastic seat. "I've been thinking about what you wrote," Reaper began. "About respect and having nothing to prove. I started reading this book, and it talks about people who build their identity on what others think. That's me, man. Everything I am in here is about what other people think." He paused, struggling with vulnerability. "I don't know who I am without that, and it scares the hell out of me." Marcus pulled out his journal, not the one where he wrote his private thoughts, but a second one he'd started for communication. He wrote, "Who do you want to be?" Reaper read the question and let out a long breath. "I want to be someone my daughter ain't ashamed of. She's 7 now. By the time I get out, she'll be 19. I want to be a man she can be proud to call her father." The honesty in Reaper's voice was raw and painful. Marcus wrote again, "Then be that man now. Don't wait for release. Become him today." Reaper looked at the words for a long time. "How?" he asked simply. Marcus pointed to the journal, then to Reaper's chest, over his heart. The message was clear. Start by being honest with yourself. Before Reaper left, he paused at the cell door. "My real name is Darius," he said. "Darius Johnson. I'd appreciate if you called me that. In your head, I mean. Since you can't." He trailed off, embarrassed. Marcus stood and extended his hand. Darius shook it, and in that moment, a genuine friendship began. One built on mutual respect rather than fear or dominance. Jimmy watched this exchange in amazement. After Darius left, he shook his head. "Man, you just made friends with the most dangerous dude in this place, and you did it by not talking. I don't understand any of this." Marcus smiled slightly and wrote in his communication journal, "Sometimes the most important conversations happen in silence." Jimmy read it and laughed. "You know what? You're probably the wisest guy I've ever met. And that's crazy because you literally can't give advice the normal way." The hidden past. 3 weeks into his sentence, Marcus received his first visitor. The guard came to his cell during afternoon count. "Webb, you got someone in the visitor's room. Let's go." Marcus's entire demeanor changed instantly. His shoulders tensed, his breathing quickened, and something like fear flashed across his face. Jimmy noticed immediately. "You okay?" he asked. Marcus didn't respond, just stood and allowed himself to be escorted out. The visitor's room at a Redstone was a depressing space with scuffed linoleum floors and bulletproof glass dividing inmates from their guests. Marcus was directed to booth 7, and when he saw who was waiting, he stopped so abruptly that the guard behind him nearly ran into him. On the other side of the glass sat a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled into a ponytail and eyes that had seen too much pain. "Move it, Webb," the guard ordered. Marcus walked slowly to the booth and picked up the phone. The woman did the same. For several long moments, they just looked at each other, years of complicated history passing between them in that silence. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice breaking. "Hi, Marcus. It's been a long time." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he gestured to the notepad he'd brought. He wrote quickly and held it up to the glass. "Sarah. You shouldn't have come." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I had to. When I heard what happened, that you were in here. Marcus, why did you do it? Why did you attack him?" Marcus wrote again, his handwriting less steady now. "You know why." Sarah pressed her hand against the glass. "He wasn't worth it. He wasn't worth you throwing your life away." Marcus shook his head vehemently and wrote, "He deserved worse than what I gave him." The guard monitoring the visit leaned forward slightly, interested despite himself. This was clearly not a typical prison visit. Sarah wiped her eyes. "Emily asks about you," she said, and Marcus went completely still. "She doesn't understand why Uncle Marcus doesn't visit anymore. She's only 6, so she doesn't know what happened. What he did to me. What he almost did to her." Marcus's face cycled through emotions, pain, rage, guilt, love, all barely contained. He wrote frantically. "How is she? Is she safe? Are you both safe?" Sarah nodded. "We're safe. He's gone now. You made sure of that. But Marcus, you're paying the price for protecting us, and I can't let you do this alone." She pulled out several photographs and held them up to the glass one by one. Emily at her 6th birthday party, blowing out candles. Emily's first day of school, wearing a backpack almost as big as she was. Emily at the park, laughing on a swing. Marcus pressed his free hand against the glass, matching where Sarah's had been, tears streaming down his face silently. "She made you this," Sarah said, holding up a drawing. It showed 2 stick figures labeled me and Uncle Marcus with a giant red heart between them. The title at the top read, "I miss you," in a child's uneven handwriting. Marcus broke completely, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs that he couldn't voice. The guard looked away, giving him a moment of privacy. When Marcus regained control, he wrote, "Tell her I love her. Tell her everything I did to keep her safe." Sarah nodded. "I know. And when she's old enough, I'll explain everything. I'll make sure she knows you're a hero, not a criminal, that you saved us." She paused. "Marcus, what he did to you, taking your tongue, that was before you stopped him, wasn't it? That was part of why you—" Marcus nodded slowly. Sarah closed her eyes, fresh tears falling. "My brother did that to you. My own brother. And I didn't know until it was too late. I'll never forgive myself for not seeing what kind of monster he'd become." Marcus shook his head firmly and wrote, "Not your fault. You were his victim too. Don't carry his sins." They sat in silence for a moment, the phone pressed to their ears, years of shared trauma and love between them. Finally, Sarah said, "I'm going to write to you, and I'm going to send pictures. I know you can't respond the way you'd want to, but I need you to know you're not forgotten. You're not alone." Marcus wrote one more message. "That's all I needed to hear." After Sarah left, Marcus was escorted back to his cell. He walked like a man in a daze, barely aware of his surroundings. Jimmy took one look at him and knew something significant had happened. "Bad visit?" he asked gently. Marcus sat on his bunk, pulled out his private journal, and began writing furiously, page after page, the words pouring out in a torrent. That night, unable to sleep, Jimmy heard Marcus climb down from his bunk and sit on the floor, his back against the wall. In the dim light, Jimmy could see him holding the photograph that usually stayed face down, the one of him with a little girl on his shoulders. both of them laughing. "That Emily?" Jimmy asked softly. Marcus nodded without looking away from the picture. "She's your daughter?" Another headshake. "Niece?" A nod. "She's why you're here, ain't she? Something happened to her or her mom, and you handled it." Marcus looked at Jimmy then, and his expression confirmed everything. Jimmy came down from his bunk and sat beside Marcus on the cold concrete floor. "Listen," Jimmy said. "I don't need to know the details, but I want you to know something. Whatever you did, whoever you hurt to protect that little girl and her mom, anybody with a soul would understand that. You're not a criminal, Marcus. You're a protector, and that's the most honorable thing a man can be." Marcus turned the photograph so Jimmy could see it properly. The image showed a younger Marcus, pre-injury, laughing genuinely as the little girl on his shoulders waved at the camera. He looked like a different person, lighter, happier, unbroken. Jimmy studied it. "You're gonna get back to her," he said firmly. "However long your sentence is, you're gonna do your time right, and you're gonna get back to that little girl. You hear me?" Marcus pulled out his communication journal and wrote, "That's the only thing keeping me alive." Jimmy read it and put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Then we make sure you survive this place. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. When you walk out of here, you're gonna be the uncle that little girl deserves. We're gonna make sure of it." For the first time since arriving at Redstone, Marcus felt something other than despair. He felt hope, fragile and tentative, but real. He wrote one more thing in his journal that night, after Jimmy had gone back to sleep. "Sarah and Emily are safe. That's all that matters. I would sacrifice my voice 1,000 times over to ensure their safety. Prison is nothing compared to knowing they're finally free from him." Brotherhood formed. The revelation of Marcus's past, though not explicitly shared, changed how people saw him. Word spread through the peculiar prison grapevine that the silent man had family who cared about him, that there was a little girl waiting for him. In a place where most men felt abandoned by the world, this made Marcus more human, more relatable. It also made him more valuable to those who understood that protecting something you love is the strongest motivation of all. Darius Johnson had become an unlikely ally, but his transformation was causing ripples of its own. His crew was confused by their leader's sudden interest in the silent inmate who'd once been their target. Tyrell, Darius's lieutenant, confronted him in the yard one morning. "What's going on with you, Reaper? You're spending time with Silent Bob, reading books, acting different. The guys are talking." Darius looked at Tyrell, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. "Let them talk," he said simply. "I'm tired of being who they expect me to be. I got a daughter out there who deserves better than a father who's proud of being feared." Tyrell's face showed surprise, then something like respect. "All right then," he said. "But if you're changing, you need to know some of the guys ain't gonna follow. They like things how they are." "Then they don't have to follow," Darius replied, and walked away. He found Marcus in the library, reading at a corner table. "Can I sit?" he asked. Marcus gestured to the empty chair. Darius pulled out the book Mrs. Chen had given him, now dog-eared and heavily marked. "This book talks about two types of character, resume virtues and eulogy virtues. The stuff you put on a resume versus what people say at your funeral." Marcus nodded, familiar with the concept. Darius continued. "I realized everything I built in here is resume stuff. Strongest guy, most feared, leader of the biggest crew. But at my funeral, my daughter would have nothing good to say. That's gotta change." He paused. "I want to ask you something, and you can tell me to go to hell if you want. Will you help me figure out how to be better?" Marcus considered this carefully, then pulled out his communication journal. "Why me?" Darius smiled slightly. "Because you're the only person in here who's got nothing to gain from giving me advice. You don't want anything from me. You don't fear me. You just exist, doing your time, staying true to whatever code you live by. I need that kind of honesty." Marcus wrote again. "Change is hard. It means losing who you were. Are you ready for that?" Darius read the question and was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," he he admitted. But I know I gotta try. For my daughter. For myself. Marcus nodded and wrote a longer message. Then we'll figure it out together. But understand, real change means some people will hate you for it. They'll say you've gone soft. They'll test you. Let them, Darius said with conviction. And so an unlikely mentorship began. Every day, Marcus and Darius would spend time together, in the library, in the yard, wherever they could find relative privacy. Marcus would write responses to Darius's questions about anger management, about finding identity beyond violence, about being a father from prison. And slowly, Darius Johnson, the feared inmate, began transforming into the man who wanted to be a good father. Jimmy watched this development with amazement. "You know what you're doing is crazy, right?" he said to Marcus one evening. "You're rehabilitating the prison bully. Social workers couldn't do what you're doing, and you can't even talk." Marcus shrugged and wrote, "Everyone deserves a chance to change, including him." But not everyone was happy about Darius's transformation. A faction of his former crew, led by an inmate named Razor, saw opportunity in their leader's weakness. Razor was a career criminal who'd spent more of his life inside than out, and he thrived on the chaos and violence that Darius had previously encouraged. During a gathering in the yard, Razor made his move. "Reaper's going soft," Razor announced to a group of inmates. "Hanging out with Silent Bob, reading books, talking about feelings and shit. That ain't leadership, that's weakness. This block needs a real leader." Several inmates nodded agreement. Others looked uncertain. The social structure that had been stable for years was fracturing, and fractures in prison led to violence. Darius heard about Razor's challenge within hours. Prison had no secrets. He found Razor lifting weights in the yard and approached him directly, Marcus and Jimmy a few paces behind. "I hear you got something to say about me," Darius said calmly. Razor set down the weights and stood, his muscled frame gleaming with sweat. "Yeah, I do. You ain't Reaper no more. You're just some dude who forgot where he came from." "You're right," Darius said, shocking everyone within earshot. "I'm not Reaper anymore. That person was built on fear and violence, and I'm done being him. If you want to lead Razor, go ahead. But you won't do it through me." The yard had gone completely quiet. In prison hierarchy, this was unprecedented. A leader voluntarily stepping down. Razor laughed mockingly. "Just like that? You're giving up everything you built?" Darius shook his head. "I'm not giving up anything. I'm choosing something different. There's a difference." He turned to walk away, and Razor made his mistake. He grabbed Darius's shoulder and spun him around. "Nobody walks away from me." What happened next was so fast that most inmates missed it. Darius caught Razor's wrist, twisted it expertly, and had him on the ground in a controlled hold in less than 2 seconds. But instead of following through with the violence everyone expected, Darius leaned close to Razor's ear. "I could hurt you right now," he said quietly. "Real bad. That's who I used to be. But I'm choosing not to. That's who I'm becoming. Don't test me again." He released Razor and walked away, leaving the defeated inmate on the ground. The message was clear. Darius wasn't weak. He was choosing strength of a different kind. Marcus, who'd watched the entire exchange, gave Darius a subtle nod of approval. Jimmy whispered, "Holy shit. That was the most badass thing I've ever seen." That evening, Officer Henderson called both Darius and Marcus to his office. "I saw what happened in the yard today," he said. "Johnson, you could have seriously hurt Razor. You showed restraint I've never seen from you. Webb, I don't know what you're doing, but you're changing this block in ways I can't explain. The warden noticed too." Darius spoke up. "Officer Henderson, I want to request a transfer to the rehabilitation program. Education classes, therapy, whatever you got. I'm serious about changing." Henderson's eyebrows rose. In 12 years, Darius Johnson had never expressed interest in any rehabilitation program. "I'll put in the request," he said slowly. "But you need to know, change doesn't erase your record, doesn't reduce your sentence." "I know," Darius replied. "I'm not doing it for early release. I'm doing it to be the man my daughter needs when I finally get out." Henderson looked at Marcus, who nodded in confirmation of Darius's sincerity. "All right then," Henderson said. "I'll see what I can do." As they left the office, Darius turned to Marcus. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up on me before I even asked for help." Marcus pulled out his journal and wrote a final message for the day. "We're all capable of change. Some of us just need someone to believe in us first." Darius read it, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something like pride in himself, not for what he could take or destroy, but for what he might become. The truth revealed 2 months into Marcus's sentence, the prison received an unusual visitor. A journalist named Daniel Matthews from a military veterans advocacy organization had requested permission to interview several veteran inmates for a story about the failures of the VA system. Warden Lawson approved the request, and Marcus's name appeared on the list of potential interview subjects due to his military record. When Officer Henderson informed Marcus of the interview request, Marcus's reaction was immediate and visceral. He shook his head violently and wrote in sharp, angry strokes, "No interviews, no press, no exceptions." Henderson was surprised by the intensity. "Webb, this could be good for you. Public sympathy, maybe help with appeals or early release. Why refuse?" Marcus wrote, "My story isn't for sale." Henderson sighed but respected the decision. However, Daniel Matthews was persistent. He'd done his research and discovered that Marcus Webb was something of an enigma, a decorated veteran with a Purple Heart and Bronze Star, who'd been dishonorably discharged under mysterious circumstances, then convicted of assault nearly resulting in death, all while unable to speak. The story screamed injustice, and Matthews smelled a major piece. Matthews approached Mrs. Chen in the library, explaining his interest. "I believe there's more to Marcus Webb's story than what's in his file," Matthews said. "I think he's protecting someone or something. If I could just talk to him, maybe I could help." Mrs. Chen studied the journalist carefully. "Mr. Matthews, some stories are protected by silence for good reason. If Marcus doesn't want to talk, or in his case, write, about what happened, perhaps we should respect that." But Matthews was undeterred. He began interviewing other inmates, including some from Marcus's unit in Afghanistan. One of them, a former sergeant named Carlos Mendez, was serving time at Redstone for drug trafficking. When Matthews mentioned Marcus Webb, Carlos's face transformed. "Webb? Marcus Webb is here? In this prison?" Matthews nodded. "Do you know him?" Carlos leaned back, his expression a mixture of respect and sorrow. "Know him? Man, Marcus Webb is a hero. Saved our entire unit. If it wasn't for him..." He trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. "You want to know about Marcus? I'll tell you. But you gotta understand, what happened to him. It's the kind of story that proves how badly we fail our soldiers." Over the next hour, Carlos told Marcus's story, and Matthews recorded every word. Marcus's unit had been stationed in a contested region of Afghanistan, working with local interpreters and allies. One of their interpreters, Fahim, had discovered that a high-ranking military contractor was involved in illegal activities, selling weapons to insurgents, embezzling funds meant for reconstruction, even trafficking heroin. Fahim told Marcus first, Carlos explained. Marcus was like his American brother. They were tight. Marcus believed him immediately and started collecting evidence. He went to the chain of command, filed official reports, did everything by the book. Carlos's voice grew bitter. And that's when everything went to shit. The contractor Marcus exposed was well-connected, with ties to powerful politicians and military brass. Instead of investigating the claims, the military came down on Marcus, accusing him of making false allegations, of trying to undermine the mission. Marcus persisted, going higher up the chain, refusing to back down. That's who Marcus was, Carlos said. Stubborn as hell when he believed in something. Then came the night that changed everything. Marcus and Fahim were returning from a meeting with a sympathetic officer when they were ambushed, not by insurgents, but by mercenaries working for the contractor. They were taken to a remote location. Fahim was killed immediately, Carlos said, his voice breaking. They made Marcus watch. Then they tortured him, trying to make him recant his testimony, destroy the evidence he'd gathered. Matthews had stopped writing, horror evident on his face. That's when they cut out his tongue? Carlos nodded. They wanted to literally silence him, make it so he could never testify, never speak the truth. They thought removing his tongue would end the investigation. He paused. But Marcus had already sent copies of everything to multiple locations. His silence actually protected the evidence. How did he survive? Matthews asked. Carlos smiled grimly. Our unit noticed they were missing. We went looking, tracked them to the location, found Marcus barely alive. Fahim was already gone. The mercenaries tried to claim it was an insurgent attack. But Marcus... He shook his head in admiration. Even without his tongue, even after that trauma, Marcus wrote out everything, named every person involved. So what happened to the contractor? Matthews demanded. Carlos's expression darkened. That's where it gets ugly. The contractor had enough connections that it got buried. National security reasons, they said. Protecting intelligence assets. Total bullshit. The official story became that Marcus and Fahim were captured by insurgents. Fahim was killed. Marcus was injured. End of story. Marcus was medically discharged, given his medals, and sent home with an NDA he couldn't violate. Matthews was furious. They silenced him twice, first physically, then legally. Carlos nodded. And Marcus carried that for years. The guilt of surviving when Fahim didn't. The rage at the injustice. The PTSD from the torture. He came back to the States broken in ways that had nothing to do with his missing tongue. What about his assault charge? The reason he's here? Matthews asked. Carlos hesitated. I don't know all the details, but I heard through the veteran network that it involved his sister and her daughter. Some kind of domestic situation that went bad. Marcus snapped, put some guy in a coma. He looked directly at Matthews. But here's what I know about Marcus Webb. He doesn't do anything without reason. If he nearly killed someone, that person deserved it. The interview concluded with Carlos making one request. Don't publish this without Marcus's permission. He's protected his silence this long for a reason. Maybe it's to protect his family. Maybe it's because he's tired of fighting. But it's his story to tell, not mine. Matthews agreed, but the journalist now possessed information that explained everything about the silent inmate who'd become a moral center in Cell Block D. Matthews requested one final interview, with Marcus himself. This time, through Mrs. Chen's mediation, Marcus agreed. They met in a private room, Officer Henderson present as required. Matthews laid out everything Carlos had told him. Marcus listened without expression, his face an unreadable mask. When Matthews finished, Marcus picked up the pen and wrote one question. What do you want from me? The truth, Matthews replied. The whole truth. Not just what happened in Afghanistan, but what happened here in the States. Why you're in prison. Let me tell your story, Marcus. Let me expose what they did to you. Marcus stared at the journalist for a long moment, then wrote extensively. When he finished, he turned the notepad so Matthews could read. The message said, My silence protects people I love. My sister and her daughter are finally safe after years of abuse. The man I attacked was my brother-in-law, the one who discovered I'd survived Afghanistan and tried to use that knowledge to control my sister. He threatened to tell Emily, my niece, graphic details of what happened to me if Sarah didn't comply with his demands. He was escalating. I made a choice. I broke his jaw so he couldn't speak. Ironic, isn't it? I'm serving time for doing to him what was done to me. But my silence in prison protects Sarah and Emily from retaliation by his family. If my story goes public, they become targets. So no, you will not tell my story. My silence is my choice now, not something imposed on me, and I choose to protect them. Matthews read the words twice, his eyes filling with tears. Marcus, that's incredibly noble, but what about justice? What about the contractor, the mercenaries who tortured you, the system that failed you? Marcus wrote one final message. Some battles aren't worth winning if the victory costs you everything. I've made my peace with silence. Have you? The journalist left Redstone that day with the story of a lifetime but bound by a moral obligation not to publish it without Marcus's consent. Consent he knew would never come. He did, however, send a detailed report to the VA and to several veterans advocacy groups, omitting names but exposing systemic failures. It was a small victory, but it was something. Officer Henderson walked Marcus back to his cell after the interview. "That took guts," Henderson said. "Turning down a chance to clear your name, maybe get early release, all to protect your family." Marcus simply nodded. Back in his cell, Jimmy immediately sensed something significant had happened. "You okay?" he asked. Marcus pulled out his private journal and wrote for hours that night. One passage read, "Today I chose silence again, but for the first time. It felt like power rather than loss. They took my voice in Afghanistan, but I'm keeping it silent by choice now. There's freedom in that. Freedom in knowing that my silence protects Sarah and Emily. Freedom in refusing to let my pain become entertainment or inspiration. Some stories are meant to be carried quietly. This is mine." The final test. With 3 months remaining on Marcus's sentence, the delicate peace in cell block D was shattered. Razor, still bitter about his public humiliation by Darius, had been plotting revenge. He'd formed an alliance with several new inmates who hadn't witnessed Darius's transformation and saw opportunity in destabilizing the block's current social order. Their target wasn't just Darius, it was Marcus, the source of Darius's change. The attack came during dinner on a Thursday evening. Marcus was sitting with Darius, Jimmy, and several other inmates who'd formed a kind of informal group around them, men seeking something different than the typical prison hierarchies. Razor approached with 4 others, surrounding their table. "Well, look at this," Razor said loudly. "The silent freak and the has-been tough guy playing house." Darius stood slowly, his full height and breadth commanding immediate attention. "Walk away, Razor. Don't do something stupid." Razor laughed. "Stupid would be letting you and Silent Bob here turn this block into some kind of therapy session. Some of us remember what prison's supposed to be about. Strength, respect, fear. You've forgotten." "No," Darius said calmly. "I've just redefined what strength means." Razor moved suddenly, throwing a punch at Darius that was more signal than serious attack. It was the excuse his crew needed. They surged forward. But what Razor hadn't counted on was that Darius wasn't alone. The men who'd gathered around Marcus and Darius stood as one, forming a protective barrier. The cafeteria erupted into chaos. Guards rushed in, batons drawn, whistles blaring. But in the confusion, one of Razor's crew, a violent offender named Pike, grabbed a makeshift shiv and went straight for Marcus. Jimmy saw it happening and threw himself in the way, taking the blade in his shoulder. He went down hard, blood spreading across his prison blues. Everything stopped. Marcus, who had remained still throughout the initial confrontation, moved with speed that shocked everyone present. He caught Pike's wrist before he could strike again, twisted it with precision that came from military training, and had the man face down on the floor in seconds. But instead of continuing the violence, Marcus held him there, applying just enough pressure to control without causing serious injury, until guards arrived to take over. Jimmy was rushed to the prison infirmary, and Marcus was escorted to solitary confinement pending investigation, standard procedure for any inmate involved in violence, regardless of circumstances. In the small concrete cell, with nothing but his thoughts and the scratchy prison blanket, Marcus had time to reflect on everything that had happened since his arrival at Redstone. He thought about the journey from Afghanistan to this moment. The loss of his voice, the loss of his friend Fahim, the years of silent suffering, the desperate act that landed him in prison, and the unexpected community he'd found among inmates who society had written off. In the darkness of solitary, Marcus realized something profound. His silence had become his greatest strength, but it was the connections he'd formed despite it that had given his life meaning again. 3 days later, the investigation concluded. Security footage clearly showed Pike attacking first with a weapon, Jimmy taking the blow, and Marcus responding with minimal necessary force to protect himself and others. Marcus was cleared of wrongdoing and released from solitary. When he returned to cell block D, he received a standing ovation from inmates, something that had never happened in the prison's history. Jimmy was still in the infirmary, recovering from surgery to repair his shoulder. Marcus went immediately to visit him. Jimmy was awake, groggy from pain medication, but smiling when he saw Marcus. "Hey man," he said weakly. "Guess I took your whole silence is strength thing too literally." Couldn't even scream when that shiv hit me. Marcus pulled out his communication journal with trembling hands and wrote, "You saved my life. Why?" Jimmy laughed, then winced from the pain. "You're my brother, Marcus, and brothers protect each other. You taught me that, not with words, but with how you lived. I was nobody when I met you, just another petty criminal doing time. But you made me want to be better, made me believe I could be better." Marcus wrote again, "You were always better. You just needed to see it." Jimmy's eyes filled with tears. "When I get out of here, I'm gonna be different. Got a real shot at parole in 6 months. And when I walk out those gates, I'm carrying everything you taught me, about dignity, about strength, about protecting what matters." Officer Henderson appeared in the infirmary doorway. "Webb, someone wants to see you. Special visitor approved by the warden." Marcus followed Henderson to the visitor's room, confused about who could be visiting. When he saw Sarah and Emily sitting on the other side of the glass, his heart stopped. Emily had grown in the month since he'd last seen a photograph. She was holding a sign that read, "We love you, Uncle Marcus," in careful, colorful letters. Marcus picked up the phone with shaking hands. Sarah spoke first. "The journalist, Daniel Matthews. He contacted me. He told me what you said, about protecting us with your silence. Marcus, you don't have to do that anymore." Her voice broke. "Tom's family gave up trying to retaliate. They want nothing to do with any of this. You can speak or write your truth now." Emily pressed her small hand against the glass, and Marcus matched it with his much larger one. Through Sarah, she said, "Mommy told me what happened, that bad people hurt you, but you stayed strong. She said you're a hero." Marcus's silent tears flowed freely. Sarah continued, "You've got 3 months left, and when you walk out of here, we're going to be waiting. Emily and me. We're going to be a family again." Marcus wrote shakily, "I don't deserve this. Don't deserve you both." Sarah shook her head firmly. "Yes, you do. You've paid your debt. To society, to yourself, to whatever guilt you've been carrying. It's time to live again, Marcus. Really live, not just survive." Emily piped up through Sarah, "And I wrote you letters. Mommy kept them all for when you come home." For 30 minutes, Marcus sat with his sister and niece, communicating through notes and gestures and the kind of love that doesn't need words. When the visit ended and they left, Marcus returned to his cell transformed. Jimmy, back from the infirmary with his arm in a sling, took one look at him and grinned. "Good visit, huh?" Marcus nodded, and for the first time since arriving at Redstone, he smiled, fully, genuinely, with hope shining in his eyes. Darius found them later that evening. "Heard about your visitors," he said. "Family waiting for you on the outside. That's everything, man." He pulled out a letter from his pocket. "My daughter wrote me. First time in 2 years. Said her mom told her I was working on being better, and she wants to get to know the real me." His voice was thick with emotion. "That's because of you, Marcus. You showed me it was possible." Marcus wrote in his journal, "You did the work. I just believed you could." The 3 men, Marcus, Darius, and Jimmy, sat together in the cell as evening count was called. They were an unlikely trio. A silent veteran carrying unimaginable trauma, a reformed bully rediscovering his humanity, and a petty criminal learning what real strength looked like. But they were brothers in the truest sense, forged by circumstance and choice. Razor and his crew were transferred to another facility after the cafeteria incident. Cell Block D settled into a new normal, one built on respect rather than fear, on community rather than hierarchy. Officer Henderson remarked to Warden Lawson, "I've been working in corrections for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what Webb accomplished here." And he did it without saying a single word. The warden, who had initially been skeptical, now understood. "Sometimes," she said thoughtfully, "the most powerful changes come from the quietest sources." Webb reminded these men that they're human beings, not just inmates. That their stories aren't over. That they can choose who they want to become. She paused. "That's rehabilitation in its truest form. The power of silence." Marcus Webb walked out of Redstone Correctional Facility on a cold December morning, his sentence completed, his time served. The clothes he wore, donated from a veterans' charity, hung loosely on his frame. He'd lost weight inside, but he'd gained something more valuable: peace with his silence and hope for his future. At the gates, Sarah and Emily waited. Emily broke away from her mother and ran to Marcus, throwing her small arms around his waist. "Uncle Marcus!" she cried. Marcus dropped to his knees and hugged her tightly, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sarah joined them, and for several minutes, the three of them stood there in the cold, holding each other, a family reunited against all odds. Behind them, watching from the prison window, stood Darius and Jimmy. Jimmy had 6 months left on his sentence. Darius still had years. "Think we'll see him again?" Jimmy asked. Darius shook his head. "Nah, man. And that's good. That's how it should be. Marcus did his time, kept his dignity, protected his family. Now he gets to live." "What about us?" Jimmy asked quietly. Darius put his hand on Jimmy's shoulder. "We keep doing what Marcus taught us. We become better men, and when we finally get out, we live in a way that makes him proud. That's how we honor what he gave us." They turned away from the window, returning to their cells, carrying forward the lessons learned from a man who never spoke but said everything that mattered. In the weeks that followed, Marcus began the difficult process of reintegration. Sarah had arranged for him to see a therapist specializing in trauma and PTSD. Dr. Patricia Chen, no relation to the prison librarian, was a veteran herself who understood what Marcus had endured. In their sessions, Marcus wrote extensively, finally processing years of buried trauma in a safe environment. One session, Dr. Chen asked him a crucial question. "Marcus, you've protected your silence for years. But now that the threats to your family are gone, have you considered that healing might require finding a different kind of voice?" Marcus wrote, "I don't know how to be anything other than silent." Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Silence was your armor, your protection, your power. But armor can also become a prison. Have you thought about what you might want to say if you could?" Marcus considered this for a long time, then wrote extensively. The message read, "I would tell Fahim's family that he was brave and good, and that I'm sorry I couldn't save him. I would tell Sarah that she was never weak for staying, only strong for surviving. I would tell Emily that her uncle will never let anything hurt her again. I would tell Darius and Jimmy that they have the strength to become whoever they want to be. And I would tell myself that losing my voice didn't mean losing my value." "You just did," Dr. Chen said gently. "You just said all of that. Maybe not with spoken words, but you found your voice anyway. A different kind of voice, but one that speaks just as clearly." She paused. "Marcus, there are surgical options now for people with your injury. Prosthetics, electronic devices that could help you speak. Have you considered them?" Marcus's response was immediate. "No." Dr. Chen waited for more. Marcus wrote, "My silence is part of who I am now. It taught me to listen more carefully, to observe more closely, to choose my communications with intention. I don't want to change that. I've made peace with it." Dr. Chen smiled. "Then that's your answer. Some scars we carry, and some we heal. You get to choose which is which." Emily adapted to her uncle's condition with the ease of children. She learned basic sign language, and Marcus taught her through written notes how to read people's expressions and body language. "Uncle Marcus sees more than people who talk all the time," she told her mother seriously, "because he watches instead of waiting to speak." Sarah marveled at her daughter's wisdom. 6 months after Marcus's release, Jimmy walked out of Redstone. Marcus and Sarah were waiting at the gates. Jimmy stopped in shock. "You came?" Marcus held up a sign. "Family shows up." Jimmy broke down crying, and Marcus embraced him. That night, they had dinner together. Marcus, Sarah, Emily, and Jimmy. A makeshift family formed from trauma and healing. Jimmy had gotten a job at a construction company willing to hire former inmates. He rented a small apartment near Sarah's house. Once a week, he and Marcus would meet for coffee, sitting in comfortable silence sometimes. Other times, Marcus filling pages of his journal, while Jimmy talked about his struggles and victories in rebuilding his life. A year later, Marcus received a letter from Darius. The handwriting was painstaking, clearly from someone unused to writing much. The letter read, "Marcus, my friend. I completed my GED. I'm taking college classes through the prison education program. My daughter visited last month, and we talked for the whole hour. Really talked. She told me she's proud of me. I never thought I'd hear those words. You changed my life without speaking a single word. That's power. That's real strength. I hope you're finding peace out there. You deserve all of it. Your brother, Darius." Marcus wrote back immediately, filling pages with encouragement and updates about his own life. They maintained a correspondence that would continue for years. Two men from completely different worlds united by a shared transformation. On the second anniversary of his release, Marcus visited Fahim's family. He'd located them through military channels and had been building up courage for months. Fahim's mother, Amina, welcomed him into her home. Through an interpreter and written notes, Marcus told her everything. About Fahim's bravery, about the contractor's betrayal, about the night that took Fahim's life, and Marcus's voice. Amina wept, holding Marcus's hands in hers. Through the interpreter, she said, "My son loved you like a brother. He wrote about you in his letters. He said you were the only American who truly saw him as equal, as family. Thank you for telling me the truth. Thank you for honoring his memory with your silence. Not everyone would be strong enough to carry that burden." Marcus wrote, "Fahim was braver than I ever was. He deserved better than what happened." Amina shook her head firmly. "He would be proud of you. Proud of how you protected your family, how you survived, how you found meaning in your silence. This is how you honor him, by living fully despite what was taken from you." As Marcus drove home that evening, something within him shifted. The guilt he'd carried for surviving when Fahim didn't, guilt that had weighed on him for years, began to lift, not disappearing entirely, but transforming into something more manageable. A commitment to live in a way that honored his fallen friend's memory. 3 years after his release, Marcus started volunteering at a veterans center, working with soldiers dealing with PTSD and trauma. His silence, rather than being a barrier, became a powerful tool. Veterans who couldn't articulate their pain found relief in Marcus's presence. Someone who understood without needing explanation, who listened without judgment, who proved through his existence that you could survive the unsurvivable. He also began volunteering at Redstone, approved by Warden Lawson to speak with inmates about rehabilitation and reintegration. Speak being relative, Marcus would write responses to questions, share his journey through written materials, and most importantly, simply be present as proof that life after prison was possible. On one of these visits, a young inmate approached him nervously. "Mr. Webb, I'm Devin. We met when you first came in. You gave me a note that said to fight for who I wanted to become. That saved my life. I was planning to kill myself, but your words made me reconsider." Marcus pulled out his journal and wrote, "And who did you decide to become?" Devin smiled through tears. "Someone who helps others the way you helped me." Emily grew into a thoughtful teenager who wanted to become a therapist. "Because of Uncle Marcus," she told everyone. "He showed me that healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about becoming whole in new ways." She wore a necklace with a pendant that Marcus had given her. A small silver voice that represented everything he couldn't say, but communicated nonetheless. On the 5th anniversary of his release, Marcus sat in the small house he now shared with Sarah and Emily. Sarah's abusive marriage long behind her. A new life built on safety and mutual support. He pulled out the leather journal Mrs. Chen had given him in prison, now filled cover to cover with entries. On the last page, he wrote one final message. "Silence was forced upon me as a weapon, meant to destroy me. But I transformed it into armor, then into a tool, and finally into a gift. My silence taught me to listen deeply, to observe carefully, to choose my expressions with intention. It protected those I love. It helped others find their own voices. It proved that words are not the only language of strength. I am Marcus Webb. I am silent, and I have more to say than I